Welcome to the Research Works podcast, live from the European Academy of Childhood Disability Conference 2024 in Bruges, Belgium. Join us for interviews with keynote speakers, world-renowned researchers and clinicians, and behind-the-scenes stories from one of the great paediatric conferences in the world.
Well, it's the beginning of day 2 of the conference, and right now I have a very special guest, a very dear friend of mine who I haven't seen in person for a very long time, lives in Perth, but hey, let's get together when we're here in Belgium. Natasha Bear, PhD candidate from Curtin University. Welcome, Tash.
Thanks, Dana.
So lovely to have you here on this podcast. And we're going to be talking about a paper that you'll be presenting over the conference. It's called Predicting the Risk of Respiratory Disease and Cerebral Palsy, the Development and Validation of an Online Risk Prediction Tool. It's a very catchy title. So much stuff there to be able to talk about. Now, before we delve into this topic, how about you give us a bit of a snapshot overview about what this is all about?
Sure. Well, respiratory disease in cerebral palsy is a problem. Even though it's a motor disability, it's the leading cause of death.
Yeah.
It's one of the main reasons children go to hospital. So what we've been aiming to do in our research is identify those who are most at risk, so we can intervene earlier.
Yeah.
So part of that is initially we just looked at risk factors, and we have a checklist that's been developed and available online. But there's an opportunity to take that further and take it into a tool that actually gives you a level of risk, not just saying you are at risk. Like, who's at most at risk?
Yes.
And also looking at, what about if I have a couple of risk factors? What if I just have one? What if I have 3?
Yeah.
Are there particular ones that combine together that have a higher risk? So I have a background as a biostatistician and a physiotherapist.
Yes.
So I was able to combine those two skills. Yeah. And so I created like a mathematical model that you can enter your information into and get your level of risk.
I love that. I think the first word that comes to mind is not just amazing, but nerd. I love that.
I don't mind being called a nerd. I actually have proudly a nerd.
Look, I know you well enough to say that. Otherwise, to anyone else, they might think that's so offensive. But I love that as a physiotherapist, you look at it from that real clinical perspective and then you go, okay, let's actually make this quite meaningful. And numbers do have a way of helping us to understand things that we can, often feel about in clinical practice. So let's talk about that journey from a checklist to this tool. What made you decide to go down that path? Because I imagine the online risk tool wasn't something you thought about right from the beginning, or was it?
In a way, when we started the checklist, and there is some infographic out there that shows you what the red flags and the risk factors are.
Yeah.
We did think maybe that's enough, and then you identify which ones you're most at risk, and then you can get some information about those risk factors if there's anything you can do. But to go further, everyone was thinking that was enough, but then someone said, let's validate it. Any tool needs validating.
Yeah, sure.
So we got a Victorian population. So we started in WA.
Yeah.
Then we repeated it in Victoria to validate it.
Yeah.
Now, everyone thought, we'll just repeat the analysis, and if it says the same risk factors, that's fine. I then started reading about risk prediction tools in that and realised that validation isn't just repeating the same analysis and getting the same results. It's actually putting the data into a tool and seeing if it accurately predicts those who are most at risk.
Right.
So it was a bit of a learning experience for me to go down this path of what's risk prediction. And once we started learning about it, we decided it would have more value to be able to give people a level of risk.
Yes.
And there's a lot of other risk tools out there. You might have seen some before. There's for breast cancer, prostate cancer. There's one called the FRAX, which is for fractures. So they're quite common out there. And we wanted to use the same type of technique and to give that same answers that you can get from those tools, but for children with cerebral palsy for respiratory.
Yeah.
And there's some children who would be at very high risk and some who are at a moderate risk. And it's defining where you actually
fit. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about maybe some of the risk factors, just to bring people up to speed about what they might be. Can you go through some of those for us?
Yes.
Yeah.
So the one that I always think of is having oropharyngeal dysphagia. So having trouble with managing your saliva, meal times, swallowing, needing to have a modified diet. That is one of the main risk factors.
Yes.
Other ones that come up are reflux, seizures, Snoring on a nightly basis
Wow.
came up as one. And I was always, that consistently has come up. So it must represent something around the oromotor area or that's causing some issues.
Yeah.
The other red flags is if you have had a previous hospitalisation for respiratory in the previous year, approximately half will come in the next year again, which is really high. And it's about flagging those children because in the past they would just keep coming in but not necessarily have any active intervention in the space.
Sure.
So that is another red flag to come. Yeah. And GMFCS5 is there as a red flag.
Yeah.
I just want to put on that though, that the oropharyngeal dysphagia is actually more of a risk. So if you were going to choose one, I wouldn't just go on GMFCS5. A lot of them have oropharyngeal dysphagia. But then what you miss is the GMFCS1s and 2s and 3s.
So true.
Because there's an assumption it's all the children who are GMFCS5.
Yeah, that's such a good point, isn't it? Because even as you're going through those factors, immediately in my head, I'm already thinking like the picture in my head is that. And yes,
which
that's
is not
true.
incorrect.
That's right.
Which is 100%. That is correct.
Yeah, but you don't want to miss the other kids as well, and that's the problem with I guess just assumptions and having a certain picture in your head. And
that's what this tool's to do.
Yeah,
and I think I am interested in those. Well, first of all, if children are balancing many factors, they've got Botox appointments and orthopedic surgeries, and having a tool that might give you a level of risk will help you know where it fits in your priority.
Yes.
That's what I'm trying to help people understand how important is this to me.
Yeah, that's great.
But then those children who are not automatically thought of are perhaps given some information and evidence, because some have told me that they try and talk to their GP about it and they get told, oh, but you just have CP, that's just normal. But the tool comes with information that they can print out, that they can give to a medical professional and say, actually, this one's telling me I am actually someone at risk.
Yep. So what you've really integrated there is you've already got implementation science built into all of this. Clearly, this is something that you want to have as an interface from the science to clinical practice. Now, I do really want to go into how you collected some of this data, because data is what it's all about. And I know, because I know you love data.
Yeah.
So I was looking at what you had been publishing lately, and it looks like you've been using linked data.
Yeah.
So whenever someone says linked data, I go, oh my goodness, there's so much involved in that. Please talk about what that looked like and how you use that data to get to where you are now.
Linked data is so great because we have the cerebral palsy registries in Australia. So we accessed those and sent the survey out to everyone in Western Australia.
Amazing.
And we had about 550 responses.
Wow.
Then we had the linked data unit get that information and link it up to their hospital records. So I had every hospital record they had for up to now. I've actually up to 5 years after the survey to see what happened and who went to hospital and for what. But I extracted from it the respiratory admissions because there's coding within there that you can find out what is a respiratory admission, what's an orthopedic admission.
Sure.
But it's lots of data.
Yeah.
And you have to
make sense of it all.
Yeah.
But that's the part you love the most.
It is the part I love the most, using coding to extract the information out.
Okay.
But then there's so many things you can do. Is it, did they have a hospitalisation? How many did they have? How severe were they? How long did they stay? Did they go to ICU? Like it's a little bit limitless, and you have to refine what you're going to do.
Like, what's the question, I suppose, and really be quite clear about that. And, I've learned a lot of that from you as well. Whenever we're doing statistical analysis, you're like, what's the question? It's everything at the moment, Tash. So let's be a bit more specific. Okay, so for you, what would you say were some of the main findings? Because like you said, there's a lot of information there, but what are the things that really stuck out for you, and I guess how that influenced the direction of your study?
The main findings?
Yeah.
So when you do the mathematical modelling, you have a whole list of risk factors, but they all don't go in. They all can't go in.
Yeah.
And you combine them in a way that makes the best model.
Sure.
So the ones that are in there, I'm not going to say are necessarily the most important things in the world. They're the ones that combine uniquely together to build like an additive risk for each thing. So when people have one or more adds up.
Okay.
And what I found interesting is just seeing the weighting of each of those and which ones are weighted highly.
How do you do that? This probably feels like it needs a diagram and a whiteboard for you to explain this for me. Let's see, you've always explained things very well for me, but how do you look at weighting? How does that work?
Well, you build a regression model and then that has a number in front of it, just like an equation.
Sure.
And then the higher the number, the more weighting it has.
Okay, yeah.
And there's a bit more maths to it in the end where it has to then be put into an actual risk, like what they say, a predictive probability. So what's your likelihood?
Yes.
So when you put someone's data into my model, it'll say you have a 20% risk of having a hospital admission for respiratory in the next 2 years.
Yes, okay.
And I think I was just surprised at some of the weightings and the combinations and which really were the risk factors that came out, which were past year, oropharyngeal dysphagia, seizures stayed in, snoring and reflux were the ones that did stay in.
Wow, okay.
Things like GMFCS5 fall out straight away because the other factors account for those things.
I see. Yeah.
So they
form part of that. Yeah, okay.
So it's not that that's not important.
Yes.
It's just in the mathematical model, it's not required to predict.
Interesting. Okay. So at the end, when you have this interface where you can put all this information in the background, it does all this analysis that you have calculated. Then you get this prediction tool. Then you get this prediction. So is it like you said, then it's a 20% risk of, can you explain that part?
Yeah,
what does that look like?
I actually trolled through all the other tools online to see what sort of techniques people are using to communicate with. And some will say, exactly that, you have a 20% risk of this outcome. And then others would use like an infographic where you see the little people and then they colour them in with what's your risk. Yeah. And then there's also the opportunity to create it into like a minimal, moderate, high risk as well to categorise people, to give them a little bit more of it, because 20% might not mean a lot to someone, but we can define whether we think that's high, moderate or low risk for somebody. So we've done both.
Right.
So I imagine that's what you will get. But not just get a number, that's not useful. It's to give you some information about what that means for you and practical advice. Yeah. Which is already built into the checklist in a level anyway. I feel a bit fortunate that I get to add to it rather than create it from scratch. Because if you tick now where you have mealtime issues, it would tell you who's the best professional to help you, what sorts of things you can do.
I see.
So mine's not meant to replace any of that.
No, that's right.
But it's meant to supplement and give more information.
It's almost like a clinical pathway. Is that kind of what it does? So it tells you you've got this risk. So therefore, these are some of the options that you can look at right now, and hopefully that might reduce your risk potentially, or at least be prepared. Is that kind of what you're hoping it will do?
That is definitely one of them.
Yeah.
And I think the early identification is the other thing we talk about. I do have another poster, which is a little bit of a related issue, but mainly the risk factors at the moment are in more severe CP.
Yes.
And we're thinking it's more aspiration, which has a really slow onset, and you don't even see the damage or the problem until many years later.
Yeah.
And in some other work, I've noticed they come in much later for hospital admissions. But when you look at them younger, and if you do a CT, they actually have a problem younger. So the tool is to try and highlight to perhaps thinking at a younger age, and then looking at the things like seizure control and reflux and mealtime management. And as you know, when the families are trying to decide at that younger age, what will I have my appointments, how will I work with my therapist? Perhaps if they were between two things, it might be actually, I think this is now our important thing to do.
Helps to prioritise really, doesn't it? Because at the end of the day, you can spend your time doing a lot of different kinds of interventions and treatments that might not be that useful if you're not well a lot and you're in hospital a lot. So that needs to be considered.
I think you and I have both experienced that in our therapy lives of interrupted sessions because people are becoming unwell in hospital.
And this is something that's so relevant for so many people. Do you see that something like this, the work you've done in this area, very specifically in cerebral palsy, could be expanded to other populations and other groups also at risk?
Yes. Yeah, I do. So we've validated it in cerebral palsy using the Victorian population, which is really important because it's really important to go outside your zone and see, did it work elsewhere? It worked. But there's lots of tools start to translate into similar fields.
Oh,
you could use other disabilities. I wouldn't say I'd be interested in bringing in more adult. I go up to the age of 26 in my data, but I think beyond that would be interesting.
Yeah.
And it's really, really normal to refine a tool. The first one that's put out isn't, you don't have to be that's it.
Yeah, sure.
And all those tools that I mentioned before, like the fracture one, they've evolved over the years.
Right.
And sometimes there are specific ones for specific populations that are similar, but just a little bit refined for that population. Yeah. So I think that's all possible.
The start of many things, possibly a postdoc, all the things lined up for you there, Tash. Well, as a final thing, and maybe I know that we can't separate you as a clinician and as a biostatistician, but what would your message be for clinicians who are working with this population? Like, what would you really want them to think about and to do as a result of your work?
I think as long as this is working with the families is what they want. And some places I know do an annual assessment.
Sure.
It's building in something as simple as the check. It's 5 questions.
Yeah.
So building it into a regular type assessment if they feel that is working with where they're at the moment, to just consider it as an option or as a possibility that they might need to focus on.
That's such a good point. Yeah.
That's really, and I know the checklist has been working well. Well for that.
It has, it absolutely has been. And I'd really encourage people to have a look at that. Look, we'll make sure we put a link of that on our website as well, just to remind everyone where that is. And if you haven't heard of it before, this is something that's really worthwhile having a look into. But Tash, congratulations on this work and for doing your PhD and being here at the conference. It was lovely to chat with you today.
Thanks, Dana.
So good. And for all listeners, I hope you really enjoyed that as well. Stay tuned for more episodes. We will talk to you again very soon. Bye.